This week, Marta Chudolinska tells Koom about how her Polish background affected her growing up in Canada and the comics work she's done, including her ongoing project Babcia, a paper-cut comic about her grandmother and her family's history in Poland. Would this book ever come out in Poland? And if it did, what might the reaction be to a book commenting on Poland but written by someone who grew up elsewhere? First, if you appreciate the work we do on deconstructing comics and our other podcasts and want bonus content, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. Our monthly issue-by-issue look at 1960s Amazing Spider-Man comics is available to patrons, chipping in at least $4 a month. Check out our goals and rewards and pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
Okay, this is Koom for Deconstructing Comics, and I'm here with...
Marta Chudolinska.
Hi, Marta. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
So, I'm not sure where we should start, but usually I ask people to tell me a little bit about them growing up and discovering an interest in comics. Although, one of the questions I should ask you very early on is, do you see yourself as a comics artist or just artist in general that sometimes does comics?
Yeah, so I guess in my mind, I define myself as an artist first, and I think of myself as a multidisciplinary artist, so there's a lot of different sort of avenues or ways of creating that I engage in. Comics is definitely a huge part of that, so I also think of myself as a comics artist or a cartoonist, just because I've committed so much of my time as an artist to that field. But I also do printmaking, drawing, and different painting, so there is a part of my practice that's not rooted in comics.
Cool. And I know you told me a little bit earlier, but maybe you can say for listeners, how did you find your way into comics, or how did you even find your way into art school?
So I have been drawing and making things since I was a very small child. That aspect of my creativity has been there just from the very beginning, so I didn't always know that I would necessarily do something with that professionally, but I knew that I would just be making stuff my whole life. I got introduced to comics as a kid, sort of through Archie comics. My brother had a whole collection of old, like, Chris Claremont X-Men comics that I really enjoyed, and various X lines kind of affiliated with that time period, so I think we were getting them from, like, garage sales and the Penny Saver and stuff like that, but so those were coming into me from, like, the English world, and then my parents would buy us Polish comics as well. My background is Polish. So my parents weren't necessarily huge fans of comics, but I think they saw that it was things that we were reading and enjoying, so there's a lot of Polish comics that I read growing up, like Titus and Thorgal, and just, sort of well-known Polish things that were also part of my influence, I guess, in comics. And then I went to university initially not really knowing what I was doing. I explored a bunch of different things, and by second year I knew that I definitely wanted to be an artist and study that more in depth, so that's how I ended up going to art school. And in art school, actually, I studied drawing and painting and printmaking, so I was making a lot of, like, oil paintings, doing lino cuts and etchings, and those are all things that I really enjoyed, but I also found that sort of avenue of being an artist felt very limited to me. I didn't necessarily want to make artwork that only rich people in banks could afford, because there was nobody else in my life or in my life growing up who were in that class that they could enjoy artwork in that way. Even something like going to a museum wasn't necessarily something we did a lot until I went to university and started doing that. So I kind of got drawn into comics and bookmaking through printmaking, through making artist books, and then through that kind of being exposed to these comics festivals and zine fairs and artist book festivals where people were making multiples of their art and selling it in a more affordable way. And I just kept going down that path because it felt to me a way of being able to make art, but also being able to share art on a larger scale that wasn't just to this sort of privileged minority.
Sure.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, how old were you when you left Poland and came to Canada?
Yeah, so I was 6.5 when I left Poland.
Mm-hmm.
So I was quite young. I still have definitely memories of being in Poland. So I was old enough to remember it, but certainly like most of my life and upbringing has been here in Canada. I think I'm pretty lucky as an immigrant that when my family came here, a lot of my aunts and uncles and cousins came at the same time. So we sort of had this pocket of family that I know a lot of people don't have. Like a lot of people move with their immediate family and they have their parents and maybe their siblings, but we had this sort of family group. And because I was raised within that family group, I think I was exposed more to my culture. So I can speak Polish, very familiar with like Polish cooking and all different things that I think would have been harder to connect to if I didn't have that kind of larger group of people around me.
Cool. I did want to talk more about what you just said in your previous answer, where you said you came to zine making and printmaking and comics because it was a way to get art to more people as opposed to just privilege. Would you then say that it's mostly political that's influenced you to kind of go down that path?
I think that's a part of it, but I won't say that's all of it. I do think that comics and just like making books and publications allows me to funnel in both art making and writing. And writing is also something that's been like a pretty strong through line in my life since I was a teenager. I used to write a lot of poetry and just random stories. And, as I started making books and zines, I realized this was like a really great avenue of putting those things together. So I think part of it was that practical sort of political aspect of finding an avenue for sharing my art that made sense. But also part of it is, comics are just like this magical way of combining visual storytelling and, language. So it just brings together a lot of things that I really enjoy in a form that is so open to like experimentation and different ways of expressing that.
And how did you end up focusing on paper cuts as a way to do comics? I find that very unusual.
So funnily enough, paper cuts is the easier way for me to make comics than what I used to do.
Maybe I should get you to talk a bit about your method and your process too.
So I started off, I guess the way that I really jumped from sort of making artist books to making more comics is through a book that I made called Back and Forth. And that was a novel in 90 lino cuts that was published in 2009. And that was basically a wordless story. So it was all hand-carved and printed lino blocks that essentially put together the story that you had to visually read as a reader. And that came out in 2009. That was actually nominated for a Doug Wright Award at TCAF, Toronto Comic Arts Festival. So that was sort of this thing where I made this book because I was really interested in telling this story. It was something I really wanted to kind of get out of myself, but there was some kind of response from the comics community. And I think up until that point, I didn't really think that there was space for me in the comics community. It was very much this sort of like, oh, you guys like me?
Did you think of it as a comic book? Were you the one who submitted it to the Doug Wright Award?
No, I think I thought of it like, I did think of it as a graphic novel, but I don't know if I thought of it as a comic, which I know graphic novels can also be kind of a pretentious term, but this was very much just like a visual novel. It's sort of hearkening back to this format that was used a lot like in the early 20th century, around the same time as silent films. There was this artist, Franz Masriel, who made like a whole bunch of them. So it is sort of...
Lind Ward,
too. Lind Ward, in the 30s. So
I think because of comic scholarship, Masriel and Ward seem to come up a lot now.
Yeah, they're a lot more well-known.
Yeah,
so I guess I thought I was making something in the vein of that, but it still felt to me that it fit within graphic novels. But I didn't necessarily anticipate that like the alternative comics community would have a response to it.
Well, the story, from what I can tell just by looking at it online, is a very kind of contemporary young person story.
Yeah.
So do you want to talk about like what you wanted to get across there or put out there?
Yeah, so it was sort of like a fictionalized story based on some experiences I had in my youth. I went to school at UBC initially and was in Vancouver, and then later came back and was in school in Toronto. So the story is set in these two different timelines where there's the same character that you're following along. In one story, they're in Vancouver, and the other, they're in Toronto, and sort of juxtaposing these two timelines or experiences. And in the story in Vancouver, they're sort of experiencing really difficult loneliness, and in the story in Toronto, they're experiencing kind of the downfall of a relationship. So, I mean, it was a pretty sad story, but it was a way for me to sort of get out a lot of these things. And I personally was really interested in creating this story that was kind of jumping back and forth between these two timelines and just like, constructing a narrative in that way. And I was also interested in sort of adding Toronto and Vancouver to a sort of like cultural understanding. Growing up, I read a lot of books and, things would be set in LA or New York or just, these sort of like pivotal cities in culture. And it felt to me like these cities in Canada were just as deserving of that. And, were the backdrop of so many people's lives. So why not like celebrate them in a book?
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that was a really great experience. Part of it was also that another great aspect of that book was that I didn't really know what I was getting into. I think it's a book of 90 lino cuts, and I made most of them over a series of 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like the way that I approach storytelling today, I probably would never do a project that quickly, but it's kind of nice to be able to have that experience and just be able to see what is possible to accomplish.
Yeah. And I think you were going to talk about how you felt that doing the paper cuts approach was easier.
Yes, yeah.
Kind of redirected.
Yeah. So the way that I typically work, whether it's with printmaking or with paper cut, is that I'll usually start by writing the story. So either I'll write like a treatment or text. Usually it's just very rough. And from there, I'll figure out, how many images are required. For the wordless story, obviously, I'm just kind of plotting what the images are going to be. But generally, I'm just figuring out the text, and then I'm figuring out how many images are required for this amount of text, and then what are these images going to be. And as I'm writing, certain points, I'll have sort of visual ideas as to how this part of the story will translate. So it's not that I'm writing and then entirely doing the sort of visual part afterwards. There's a bit of a mix-up there, but once I have the text, then I usually work things out on tracing paper. That's my favorite surface to draw on. And part of that is because for both printmaking and for paper cut, you have to reverse the image so that when it prints, it gets reversed again and it's the right direction. And for paper cuts, I'm kind of, transferring the pencil onto the reverse of the paper and then cutting it out and then flipping it over so I don't have to erase the pencil from that like really delicately cut paper. So that's why I say it's a lot easier, because what I used to do was draw it on tracing paper and then transfer it onto a block and then hand carve that block with different carving tools and then ink it up and then print it on a printing press and then scan it. And if there's multiple colors, you have to do a separate block for each color. Whereas with paper cut, I will do the same thing where I draw it out on tracing paper, but then I just transfer it onto paper, and then cut it out with an X-Acto knife or scissors. And it's really easy to layer different colors of paper together. It's really easy if you make a mistake to just grab another piece of paper, whereas with the carving, you kind of have to keep working with it. So there's a little bit more flexibility for me to make mistakes and experiment. And for this particular project, Babcia, that I've been working on, there's also kind of a cultural connection where there is this folk art practice of paper cutting called wycinanki that traditionally women would use to like decorate their homes or, just make artwork. So there's sort of like a cultural tie-in with the content of the work along with the way that I'm making it.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned Babcia, so we can talk about Babcia. By the way, I think that's what I've read of it. Anyway, it's a little masterpiece.
Oh, thank you so much.
But you're actually working on it for it to become like a 200-pager.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'll just let you talk about it, unless you want to take a bit of a break. You want me to talk about it, but
yeah, I can introduce it for sure. So this is a story that I've sort of been interested in telling for a really long time, and I wasn't sure how to approach it. And I was given an opportunity to make a serialized comic for Broken Pencil magazine. So the comic really kind of initially came out of this opportunity to make a regular comic. And they had proposed that I do something in lino cut, but I said, I'll do something in paper cut instead.
They just found your work and said, hey, can you do a strip for us?
Yeah.
It's so funny because, like, I've seen, like, Rutu Modan do something for, I think it's the New York Times, and I've seen, like, Posey Simmons do something for whatever it was, The Independent or whatever in the UK. So it's almost like you're, like, the Canadian version of...
Yeah. Like, sometimes just having that opportunity creates a space in your life to make the work. And in this particular case, because it's a story that's about, like, family history and, like, identity and culture, it's all, like, quite a lot that I was worried about. How am I going to handle this? How can I chew this project? So approaching it from a serialized comic that comes out, 4 strips a year, that was, like, a really great way of getting my feet wet and telling this story. Because
Broken Pencil is quarterly.
Yes, yeah.
And how long have you been doing this serial for?
Since 2013. So, coming up on 10 years now almost.
What a commitment.
Yeah.
And how far away are you from finishing with them?
Well, just whenever they tell me that they don't want me to have this strip anymore.
You're in there for life.
Yeah, well, I could see them potentially changing things up and just wanting some new strips in. So if that happens, that's fine. For me, it's been just a great motivator to keep kind of like putting out pages in this story. But to tell you what the story is about, Babcia is Polish for grandmother, and the comic is really about exploring my identity, Polish history, immigration, and the experience of an immigrant through my relationship with my grandmother. She had raised me when I was in Poland. My family immigrated in parts. My dad came over first, all that kind of stuff. So she was kind of my primary caregiver for part of my childhood. And then she stayed in Poland after we immigrated, but then she, pretty soon after that, started to develop Alzheimer's. So from the time that I was a child, I saw her 2 more times after that, and then really she passed away when I was a teenager. So I kind of missed out on being able to ask her certain questions about her life, her experiences, as a teenager, but also as an adult now, and just, very much feel the lack of being able to connect with her in my life. So the book is really just trying to rebuild that connection with her, understand her better, try to understand what she went through better, and then also use that as a lens of like looking at what I'm experiencing and what the world is experiencing. So, I can go in a lot of directions, I guess.
Yeah, I wrote down some of my favorite quotes, or at least the ones that kind of were the most thought-provoking from reading those strips, and I could just read them out and we can discuss them.
Sure.
I'm trying to love, this is your voice speaking in the strip. I'm trying to love better now, to use the love inside of me to encourage honesty and acceptance, to live a life without fear or regret. I hope there's enough time.
Yeah, so that's a strip that I made after one of my uncles passed away. He had a heart attack and he went into ICU and seemed like he was going to get better, but then just quickly declined. And that was a pretty big moment for my family. That was the first person to pass away in Canada. So we had this sort of, little pocket of family that moved over all around the same time and have just been very close and, seen each other for all the holidays throughout the years. And just losing him was pretty hard. Also, he was someone that I didn't necessarily see eye to eye with in a lot of ways. He was, I think, one of my dad's oldest brothers. He was quite conservative. He had his particular way of looking at the world and being with the world. But I was just kind of shocked by the fact that when he passed away, all I could remember were, like, the beautiful, wonderful things about him. I could remember, like, him giving out candy to all the kids and just... it was just kind of a stunning moment in terms of realizing how much life can push all those death can push all those differences away, and you just kind of realize the ways that you connected with someone. And I think at the same time, my brother's wife was pregnant with her first child, so it was this sort of time of like losing someone, but having someone else new join the family, and just trying to think about love in this more expansive way and not letting these sort of political boundaries between people, or just, different ideological differences keep you from connecting with people and loving people. Because when it comes down to it, once someone's gone, you kind of realize, of course, those things matter. Like, people's political beliefs have a huge impact on the world, but at the same time, like, those connections between you are still so powerful and so valuable.
Yeah, the reason why I wrote this particular quote down, I didn't write down too many, but it's just there's such a sense of love in your work, in Babcia, but also in other strips that you do. And I can kind of sense the politics, but I feel like the sentiment, that need to like love and heal everything and be sensitive to people and life is so strong. Is that like a very conscious thing as you're doing your strips? Or is it just something that's somehow just naturally there subconsciously? I don't know if it's super conscious. It depends on which work we're looking at, but I think it's just something about myself that comes through my artwork. Like, I am an extremely sensitive person, but I think that as much as that leads me to get hurt in certain ways, it has also made me extremely empathetic and, just wanting to embrace the world as much as possible. I was raised Catholic as well and didn't necessarily gel very well with that ideology. Like, that was something I struggled with my family as well, was just that, their religion and, the particular language of Jesus is very much about love and, loving everyone, accepting everyone. But then the rules of the religion are actually quite exclusionary and like focused on how human beings are bad, rather than focusing on like how you could improve and uplift your community and love and accept everyone. So, I think it's kind of this mix of, my own sensitivity coming through. And I don't know, it's also like, if you put in all this work in writing and creating artwork, at least I personally want there to be some kind of message or some sort of influence. And I don't think I sit down at a story and I think like, oh, this story is going to make people think this, or I want to, accomplish this with my story. I think it's just kind of more of a baseline thing where I just would like my work to help people, or, make people's lives better, as much as, like artwork or writing can do that. Yeah, I think that's the thing about your work that touched me the most, because I've told you a couple of times now that your work really spoke to me. It lingered with me in ways that other stuff I've seen doesn't necessarily. And like I mentioned, that image of the mother reading to the child and the flames on each of their heads, but just such a soft sense of love around that like you said, maybe personally it might like lead you into situations where you got hurt, but in terms of your art, it's really coming across.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, and it's something I'd like to be able to do with my writing more if I could. So like that really.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you.
Good. Okay, so here's another quote. It's kind of self-explanatory, but I'll ask you a question afterwards. So you're talking about all the transitions that your grandmother saw in Poland. Poland did not exist when my Babcia was born because it had been divided and conquered by 3 of its neighbors. And you mentioned around that same time in the strip that she'd lived through 5 different states or countries. But then you also talk about, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, PiS, the Conservative Party in Poland, and your worries about this kind of ideology. But wouldn't it be possible that your Babcia would have supported that party?
Yeah. There's another strip as well where, I don't know if it was in the file that I sent you, but there was one strip where I sort of think about whether how much my grandmother and I would get along. Yes. Because I do have very different views than a lot of my family. And it's very possible, like, she was a very religious person. She was very devoutly faithful. I think also living through certain experiences can lead you to have a certain political side, sort of as a counter to whatever you experience. Like, for example, if you grew up during Soviet communism, you might really not like socialist ideas, So I think there's a very strong chance she would have supported that party. My hope is that, I know that she was also someone with a lot of love in her heart, so she might have also been, exposed to different ideas and been open to change. But, that's something that I won't really know, or I'm not able to answer, is just how she would have reacted to all these things. But yeah, it is very troubling to see the state that Poland's in right now. They have a very far-right government that's been quite restrictive in terms of immigration, accepting refugees into the country, especially Muslim refugees, has been really hard on their LGBTQ populations, and recently just has the most restrictive abortion laws. So it is very challenging to see your country or your home country kind of go in this path. And just, any sort of authoritarianism or totalitarianism in Poland is very frightening to me. This is sort of the capitalist far-right version of that, which the country hasn't really seen in a really long time. But yeah, I just, it's a country that has seen so little freedom over the centuries that I just want the people to feel, be able to be safe and make decisions in their lives, not be controlled by the government in this way. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. You also make some interesting kind of connections between Poland's direction and Canada, and sort of, highlighting the myth versus the political reality. So I have this quote here: "Learning the histories of two countries as a child gave me the unusual experience of questioning the function of history and nationalism from an early age." So can I get you to talk a bit more about how you feel about living in Canada, mm-hmm. or maybe even Toronto, I don't know, as somebody who's an artist, and kind of how you approach that?
Mm-hmm. I had to go to Polish school after we immigrated, so that's on Saturdays. I think Ontario still does this, but they had this, cultural heritage program where you could learn your country's history and grammar, and it's sort of like a mixture of language and literature and grammar. So yeah, because of that, I definitely was exposed to these two histories, and I think part of that is also why I kind of wanted to write this book, just realizing how little awareness there is in Canada about Polish history. I think people hear Poland was the backdrop of the Second World War, but there's some things in the earlier quote you said about, Poland not even being on the map for over a century. There's all these interesting histories that I think people could be aware of. And also having a country that was essentially, occupied by its neighbors and then didn't exist, but then still somehow survived that time of not existing. There's some connection to me for Canada there, just in terms of the experience of Indigenous peoples. And, in Poland, it's totally normal to think that, there was these clandestine schools, and people were able to maintain their language and culture despite other governments trying to stop them from that. So I definitely see that connection now, where obviously with Indigenous peoples in Canada, that has been going on for much longer. But I think really the only solution I can see to that is the same thing that happened in Poland, is returning the land essentially to the people who were originally here first. So I definitely think about that a lot.
Do you feel like Toronto and in Canada as a whole is a caring, accepting place for people in general? For sure, the human rights record in terms of Indigenous people is awful, and it's still not something that we're able to come to terms with. But just in general, as a citizen, or as a human being, or as an artist, do you feel that kind of the reputation Canada has, which is a fairly benign one, is actually true?
Well, it's kind of both in a way. I think it would be really wrong of me to claim that Canada's not a good place in a lot of ways, because, I've experienced a lot of safety and security in this country. I've been able to live as an artist. I'm doing other things to fund my art practice, but, I'm able to do that work. I have certain freedoms as a woman. So there's a lot of liberty in Canada, but I'm also aware that a lot of that is just based on the privilege that I carry as a white person, and that's not necessarily the experience for a lot of people. I think that, immigrating kind of gives you a certain perspective that I probably would not have if I was born a white Canadian. Because you start to see how people are treated differently if their credentials, which they, did in their home country and maybe they had work experience, suddenly don't count, or maybe people are looked down upon or made fun of or considered to be less intelligent just because they speak with an accent. So I do think Canada has certain problems, and I think in a lot of ways we've also gotten away with just having our comparison to the US. And it's like, as long as the US is doing worse than Canada, Canada can get away with seeming to be fairly benign. But I think that base level, the society can be quite safe and welcoming, but there's a lot underlying that society that is quite troubled and toxic, whether it's treatments of Indigenous peoples or Canadian mining companies around the world. There's a lot that Canada does that it sort of is not acknowledged on a global scale. So I kind of see it from both sides. I feel very lucky to be in this place where I have so much control over my life, but I also see the way that this place is built to only benefit certain people.
Sure. And I'll just mention another one of these quotes I wrote down, which I think ties into what you're talking about. These ideas of who does and doesn't belong here changed over time to the benefit of those able to influence them and have defined the stories that remain. And then I wrote ... because I took another little quote where you say, I could do without the insight. And it doesn't really belong with us, but it's close by. So I like that line. Yeah, I think that kind of came out with from doing a lot of research into Polish history. So as I said, I had to go to Polish school on Saturdays. But as I've been working on this book, I've sort of had to re-educate myself about Polish history because, to be honest, there's only so much I absorbed on those Saturdays. I was very, very much did not want to be going to Polish school. The way that, the history was taught was not particularly engaging to me. So I've been sort of revisiting and sort of re-investigating what Polish history has been all about. And one thing that really surprised me was just learning about how Poland used to be much more multi-ethnic with lots of different religions, 400 years ago or something like that. Because to me, Poland has always been a very homogenous place. Everybody speaks Polish. At the time that we left Poland, it was still 95% Catholic. So just my experience of Poland has always been of a place where everybody is sharing the same sort of experiences. But prior to the partitions, before it was separated, it had quite a lot of diversity in terms of languages, in terms of religions, and that was something that kind of got blurred away after the First and Second World War. Actually, between the First and Second World War, there was kind of a culture clash where some people were trying to recreate Poland as a state in the old way, where it was this sort of commonwealth of different people, and then there was another political group that was trying to recreate the state in a much more homogenous way, and that's the way it went. So that's kind of what that quote was talking about, was sort of these, new political groups decided that the safest thing for Poland would be to make it as homogeneously Polish as possible, because then that opens it up for less kind of strife or, issues of sovereignty or control over land. But it did used to be something where, Jewish people used to be a huge part of Poland, different linguistic groups from, the local area, Ukraine, Lithuania, even Germany, and the amount of Germans in Poland. So it used to be something that was a lot more diverse and then slowly became more homogenized.
Coming up, what if Babcia came out in Poland? Also, a book about whales contacting humans. How would humans respond? But first, a reminder to join us for 20th Century TV and music trivia quiz videos and more on our Patreon page. Every month, patrons donating $4 a month or more also get a full-length podcast episode reviewing an issue of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko, and will continue through the transition to John Romita Sr. Check out our goals and rewards at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Greetings from Wayne Manor Memoirs, a podcast dedicated to exploring the Batman mythos.
Each episode, we research a character, story, contributor, or piece of pop culture related or adjacent to the Dark Knight,
And try to understand why these topics are important to the Bat mythos. I'm Joe.
I'm Kendall, and some of our favorite topics include the transformation of Mr. Zero into Mr. Freeze,
The early appearances of the Riddler,
Booster Gold,
Commandi,
Jim Aparo,
and many, many more. Check out Wayne Manor Memoirs every other Friday, wherever you download your podcasts.
and follow us at Wayne Manor Memoirs on Facebook or at W Memoirs on Twitter.
Until next time, Bat Fanatics, be brave.
And stay bold.
Do you think that there's any chance your strips could make their way to Poland and somehow enter the conversation there?
I would actually love for that to happen. I don't know at what point that could happen. I was in Poland in 2016, and I did actually meet some people in the comic scene there. Not a ton, but we went to a comic store in Warsaw, and then just were chatting for a really long time with the people there, bought a bunch of Polish comics. And the staff at the comic store actually connected me to somebody else who writes a lot about comics, who has the same last name as me, but who was not related to me. And like growing up in Canada, somebody who had the last name as me, like that is definitely my family member. So it's still very strange to me that somebody exists out there who I'm not related to that has the last name who-doh-lean-ska. But so I met this person. We had like, again, a long chat about comics, and he's someone who's like offered to connect me to people in case I want to publish it in Polish. And the other experience that I had that really inspired me to want to do that was meeting up with somebody a couple of years ago who I had met even earlier in Poland, maybe in like 2008 when I was couch surfing. So this is somebody that I stayed with, and he more recently moved to Germany. He is a gay man and no longer felt safe living in Poland. So now he's living in Germany with his partner, and they came to Toronto, so we got to see them. And he had seen my comic and stuff like that. And he was telling me a lot about how he thought it would be very valuable to have this particular voice or story, sort of having somebody who's kind of an insider and an outsider commenting on the culture. The thing that he talked about was just how, because Poland was under Soviet communist control for so long, there's like not a lack of cultural discourse, but sort of like less experience being able to talk openly about what's going on. So he thought my comic was sort of like delving into a lot of these things and could be useful. I always feel a little bit like, not squeamish necessarily, but worried about that, because I do feel both like an insider and an outsider. So part of me wonders, like, you know, how much can I be commenting on this culture that I've spent most of my life living outside of? So I worry about that, and just maybe there's certain things that I'm not aware of that, you know, is blinding me to my perspective. But
it goes both ways.
It goes both ways.
I mean, I found, like, writing about being Tamil,
yeah,
that a lot of times people who either are very Tamil or who haven't really made choices that have allowed them to kind of branch away are not really able to self-reflexively, kind of objectively critique it. And of course, if you're outside, you won't have the same resonance an insider will have. But on the other hand, you can look at it, even though you've got to take where you're coming from into you know, your thought process, you can be a lot more objective, especially about stuff that's not so great.
Yeah, and it's kind of coming back to the quote you read about just even being exposed to two different histories and becoming aware of, like, so much of these ideologies are constructed, and so much of what we believe about ourselves as a nation is constructed. So yeah, you can kind of see it from like a bit more of a removed perspective. Yeah, I'd just be interested in like how the translation will go, because maybe I'll try my own Polish translation, and then someone with like proper Polish grammar will have to come through and correct it. But that's definitely something I am thinking forward to. Right now, I'm more focused on just completing the work in itself, and then that will kind of be the next step after that. Yeah.
So how much more will you have to do to get to that 200-page mark where it's a graphic novel on its own?
Yeah, so I have... I did just receive a grant, and one of the great things about grants, other than just providing you with financial support is that grants force you to think through a project really deeply. So I have this project timeline that I outlined a few months ago. So I'm essentially planning on spending another year on the text of the manuscript, and then the year after that, basically drawing everything.
So you're really thinking in terms of years.
Yeah. Well, I've already been working on this project for almost 10 years. So there was a point where I was saying, next year the project will be done, and next year the project will be done. And then that happened enough years in a row where I just kind of had to step back and accept that this project is going to take as much time as it's going to need to take.
Do you think it'll be like your major life's work, the major thing?
I mean, I hope I have like a lot more in me after this.
But just by virtue of having taken so many
long,
years.
probably. I mean, I think also this work like has so many different points where it can resonate with a lot of different people. Like I've had lots of people who had very different immigration experiences, but still shared a lot of, just had some resonance with the story. So I do think that this is probably going to be a pretty major thing. I don't know if I'll do another project that will take this long, but I think because of just like, the family connection, the sensitivity of this content, it's something that like deserves a lot of time. And at some point I just accepted that this is like a slow burn, and some projects are just slow burns. I think that's something that can be really hard to face as an artist, because we're in this culture where everything's like fast coming out. Tons of people I know making comics have switched to making work digitally so they can work faster. It's really about, being able to produce as many books as possible. And, that also makes sense for trying to support yourself as an artist. But I think for me and the way that I work and the way that I've kind of continued to prioritize handmade kind of practice, it's just a fact that this is going to take a really long time. But thanks to this grant, hopefully it'll take, maybe like 3 more years instead of like another 5 or 10 more years.
Is it a grant that allows that much flexibility over time?
No, I mean, like, I think I'll do what I proposed in the grant for 2 years, but even the grant proposal isn't to completely finish the book.
If you don't mind my asking, is it a federal grant?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, that's why you got the 2 years.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Yeah, so it's a grant that it's a research and creation grant from the Canada Arts Council. So you can apply for 1 year, but they say you can apply for 2 years if you think the project has enough work. And this project has a lot of work to it, so I just went for it, and I figured, if they just fund me for 1 year, that'll still be great, but if they accept it for 2, that's even better. So,
awesome. Congratulations.
Thank you so much.
I have one more quote, which is my favorite quote because I feel like it really resonates with me as well, from Babcia. Does every immigrant carry in their heads an alternative version of what their lives would be if they returned to their country of birth, and another one for if they never left? Mm-hmm. So is that something you think about? Like, what would your life be like, or your artistic practice be like if you'd stayed in Poland, or even if you went back to Poland now? Yeah,
that's definitely something I think about, especially if I had never left. I still really like the idea of going back to Poland and like living there for a year or 2, or just having more experience there, because I really do enjoy being there. And, there's something about being surrounded by your like language that you grew up with, and just like, if I'm in Toronto and I hear somebody speaking Polish, that's just like a little spark of happiness for me to hear that language. But definitely that question of like, who would I be in what directions, and what possibilities would be available to me if I had stayed, because we were talking about this earlier of like intergenerational families living together. Like, I probably wouldn't be living on my own, or would not have moved out at 19 years old if I was in Poland. I guess I like to think that I would still be an artist, and that part of me would have been the same, but I don't know if I would have had the same, just the same abilities to like make that such a huge priority in my life. And whether, a lot more of that time would have been spent on survival. When my family left, that was right at the end of communist rule in Poland. So the place that Poland is in now, politically, there's a lot that I don't agree with, but, kind of economically or culturally, it's part of the EU now. There's been a lot of funding, improving infrastructure and all sorts of things. So, like, it would be a perfectly comfortable thing to live in, but, my upbringing would have been really different growing up in sort of those, like, post-communist years where everything was in transition and changing, and there wasn't a lot of employment, and it would have been a much more challenging thing to live through. So I don't know. I feel like art is something that people will do no matter what their life experiences are. But, you know, if you're living a life where you're focused on survival, that's obviously going to take a lot of your time and energy away from being able to do that. And then, of course, the political things that are happening in Poland. Yeah, like LGBTQ rights, women's rights. There's a lot of scary stuff going on, and I mean, a lot of scary stuff going on in the U.S. as well, but it's a very different thing trying to imagine a world where you don't have control over your own body and what happens to it. Yeah, and then just growing up in a culture where, you know, because of my family's religion, stuff like that, would have probably been even more pressure to get married or, you know, live in a particular way. Whereas here I've you know, been exposed to so many different things that I've been able to sort of chart my own path instead.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think the thing about Toronto is maybe it doesn't feel like culturally we're going through major shifts, but I think we're going through economic shifts, and it's getting much harder to be an artist here because the cost of living is becoming so high that you have to, like I was telling you, it's been years since I've really been working on a book properly because I've just had to work and it's just getting harder to publish and stuff. Yeah,
it is very challenging.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of artists I know who have left. My partner and I are thinking of moving out of the city as well to try to find some housing stability because you start thinking about like, okay, well, where am I going to retire? As an artist, you don't really think about retiring or kind of ending that work, but you start thinking more forward into your life and how you can continue to set up your life to be able to make artwork. And paying rent to landlords is like really not a great way of building that future for yourself. And then like there's other artists that I know and they just happen to be, you know, with a spouse or a partner that isn't an artist, and that can sometimes be a deal breaker as well. So yeah, it is something that's a lot more challenging. I really feel for, you know, young people and young artists who are just starting out in Toronto, because at least when I first came here, you know, I could share an apartment with a couple of roommates. I moved into my own apartment eventually, and that was still affordable. But I've been in the same place in Toronto for 10 years now because it feels like I can't move. Because if I move, I'm suddenly paying almost double the rent of what I'm paying now. So you can make that work in a short-term way. And like I've made it work and have, you know, been fairly successful and enjoyed my life throughout that. But it doesn't feel like a long-term plan. So yeah, I wonder what's going to happen with the city kind of, you know, as real estate continues to go up. I mean, maybe it'll be a really interesting thing. Maybe all of these like small towns around Toronto, that there's some small towns that have some interesting cultural stuff going on, and there's some small towns that are kind of just these like suburban bedroom communities. But maybe it'll mean that these small towns will develop more cultural and identity. But yeah, the city kind of feels like, hopefully it won't become increasingly soulless, but it does kind of feel like a lot of artists and creative people and just interesting human beings are being pushed out because of the affordability of the city.
Very much so, yeah. I can ask you about some of the other work you sent me. I mean, I don't have as many things to ask. Like, I can ask about Morphis and Genesis, because one is completely wordless. The other one is sort of half wordless and is half sort of with words. Are those older works? Are they? Yeah,
those are slightly older works. Morphis is a woodcut story, so it's kind of similar to Back and Forth, where it's told without any words. Again, partially that was me wanting to explore this other medium, but I think there's, very separate from Babcia and the type of content there. I'm also really super interested in science fiction and fantasy as a way of telling stories and as a way of looking at and commenting on, what we're experiencing today through these imaginary worlds.
Sorry, are you talking about Morphis or Genesis?
Kind of both.
Both, yeah.
Yeah, Morphis is more fantastical, I guess, whereas Genesis is kind of more like sci-fi, existential. But yeah, both of them are sort of ways. Are
you trying to say anything about what you believe in either of them?
I think in Genesis, yes.
So, like, you believe aliens came and seeded us?
No, I don't think aliens came and seeded us, but I think that story was sort of about trying to understand who you are in the scope of the universe with so little information. Like, I definitely believe there's aliens out there. Like, I definitely believe there's been other forms of life and probably societies out somewhere in the galaxy. Like, it's a huge galaxy. I think, humans have for too long thought very highly of themselves. So I think there's a lot more out there than just human life. Yeah, I think in those stories, it's more about tapping into kind of an atmosphere and a feeling than being so point blank in terms of explaining what you think. But yeah, the other story that I sent you that, what is it called?
Morphis?
All of Us?
All of Us, yes.
Yeah, that was the last one. So that one is also kind of, I guess, in a similar vein to Genesis, like looking at humanity's tendency to center ourselves as, the only intelligent forms in the universe.
Well, a couple of things about All of Us. It was done in sort of strips. Was it done at different times because of the strip?
No, so that was done for the 4-panel anthology, which is a project by an artist, Marco Liberté, that he's been doing for a really long time. Yeah, originally started in Carousel magazine. So he has been doing this project where he just gets different artists to create strips in this very standard 4-panel format. And he started doing these anthologies where he got people to do strips in these formats, or kind of longer form things, but still within this comic strip format. So I did the whole book all at once, or the story all at once, but I was trying to kind of create a larger narrative while still maintaining the separate comic strips, so that each one kind of reads as its own thing, but together they kind of create a larger narrative, sort of continuous narrative.
So did you do it all at once for Mark's thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I also noticed that, first of all, you had these, like, giant panels, one per page.
Yeah.
And then you just switched to the 4-panel kind of format kind of abruptly. So I was
that was also part of Mark's formatting kind of requirement. So each story starts with kind of a 4-panel strip, but each strip is a page spread. It kind of starts and ends with that. So yeah, those are just sort of the confines of this particular project, and then I kind of went with what I wanted from there.
So just for the listeners, it's a story about whales suddenly deciding to contact people, and then how human society changes over time as a result when it listens to other voices and then isn't so human-centric and decides to take money from war and commerce and put it towards relating to other animals. I like the elephantine healing.
I know, everybody wants elephant therapy.
Yeah. It also made me think about how people go to Sri Lanka to, like, you can get these things, I've never done it obviously, where, they have elephants and then you can, like, bathe with elephants or whatever. You do these things with elephants that people go. It makes me think of swimming with dolphins, which is also highly problematic. But,
I was trying to think about, like, how screwed humanity would be if we made first contact with an alien species now, with the mentality that we have, and how, like, aggressive and combative and territorial humans are. And, like, what would it require to get to a place where, making contact with an alien species wouldn't immediately lead to some sort of, like, war or,
Did you mean to strip at all tongue-in-cheek or satirically, or is it just much more of an earnest projection?
It's very earnest. I don't think there's that much about it that's satirical, and that's something I definitely worried about it, whereas, like, is this gonna... Because there's that line where you want to be, like, sort of hopeful and optimistic, where it maybe becomes like you're trying to educate people too much or kind of hit them over the head with the idea. But I think there's so much science fiction that's dystopian. So I was trying to explore, like, what if humanity suddenly got better But I think there's still an element of like my jaded perspective in there, or like an aspect of my perspective that's jaded, because it's not that humans in this story better themselves. They're literally forced to be better by another animal species. Yeah, so it just was an interesting...
Well, it's funny, because if I just read that by in and by itself, I would think maybe, especially with the... I don't mean this in a bad way, but like the childlike simplicity of the drawings, I think that maybe was a bit tongue-in-cheek, because it's just hard to believe that somebody, especially in Toronto, would... But like knowing your other stuff, I was like, no, she probably means this earnestly. And it's so sweet, and it's so loving, and it's so warm.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame because the pandemic kind of ate that book. It came out in spring 2020, so I really don't know how people have interpreted it at all. But it's funny too, because since I made that comic, I've been keeping this bookmarks folder where I just bookmark all of these articles that are coming out about ways that humans are communicating with animals. I'm like, I don't know, I might have just told the future in my story, but, you know, like indigenous peoples communicating with whales, or just recently there was a study about crows where they're like, no, crows definitely have a consciousness. And yeah, just kind of again coming back to this idea of like humanity centering themselves as the be-all and end-all of existence. And through science, we're slowly learning that, like, no, just because a bird's brain is smaller doesn't mean that it doesn't have intelligence. Like, all these other things can have intelligence. We are not, you know, this hierarchical top of the pyramid. We are just beings within another subset of beings. And I don't know, part of me is really interested or excited to, like, explore what could happen if we embrace those ideas. I'm also a really huge fan of Ursula Le Guin. And I really love how in her work and a lot of her kind of like novels and stories, she'll kind of create a construct of society and then just like play out how it works. Like, oh, what if there was a society without any gender? How does that change all these interactions within people? Or what if there's a society where whatever it is, and then it allows you to kind of, you know, explore human relationships or human tendencies in the ways that we experience the world, but just in this new envelope. And maybe that even leads back to Babcia and like looking outside on a particular like culture or a nation or a national ideology and being like, this is this thing we've created. What if we created a different thing? How would things be possible within that? Yeah.
I want to go back to, you said that in 2009 you had your book of lino cuts come out, and it was nominated for a Doug Wright Award.
Yeah.
And then you were kind of surprised because you were like, oh, so the people in the comics community will welcome me. Since then, has it been just an ongoing thing where you feel like you're part of the comics community, or...?
I do feel like I'm part of the comics community to a certain extent. I don't know if I'm part of the comics community that people outside of the comics community know about, if that makes sense. That's kind of a roundabout way of saying it. But like one wonderful thing about alternative comics is that it's a scene that's just so welcoming and easy to enter into. Like you can start tabling, like you have to get into a festival, but you can just start tabling at a festival, self-publish your work and start sharing it. That's usually there's just so much more gatekeeping that you have to pass through to like get a book published with a publisher or like get artwork in a gallery. So yeah, I've been showing and sharing my work at festivals for over 10 years now. So I definitely feel part of that community. I have so many friends, inspiring creators that I know that I feel connected with. But I don't necessarily feel like my work has gotten to the point where like people outside of the comics community are that aware of it.
Do you see yourself as an alternative comics artist, and like do you see yourself in the same pool with, say, Ariel Bordeaux and Gabrielle Bell and people like that? Or is there some other subset or group that you see yourself as part of?
No, not necessarily. I guess I'd say I'm part of that community. I guess, like, it's funny because... Are there any artists that you feel are, like, really your peers, that you're in kind of the same ethos with? I don't know. It's really hard to say. I mean, there's, like, a lot of people I admire whose work that I really connect with. I don't know if I necessarily put myself on their level. Like, Like, I'm a big fan of Eleanor Davis, her work. I'm a big fan of Linda Barry, even though she does quite different work, but just,
Sure.
The spirit and energy that she's trying to express to the world. It's funny because it's alternative comics, which sounds like this niche thing, but really it's just like any comics that are not superhero comics. So it's like really they're comics that could be about anything, and I know people who do, like non-fiction educational comics or do fiction or, there's such a huge range. It's just like any kind of story you could think of telling in the comics form. That's kind of who I see myself as a part of, all these people just using comics as a way of telling stories. But really that field is immense, and really any kind of story you could tell, you could probably tell in comics form. So
Yeah. I met you at this past TCAF in June 2022. When I was looking on your website at the list of shows you'd attended, the last time I could see that you went to TCAF was like 2011 or something. It was a really long time ago. Is that not true?
No. I've done TCAF pretty much every single year since 2011.
You were placed really prominently this year.
Yes.
Are you always that close to
No, I don't know what happened there. We were very excited to have that space. We were like right at the entrance of TCAF.
Yeah.
I've had, in the first early years, I tabled with my publisher, the Porcupine's Quill. So they had a couple of other books that they did that were wordless novels made with printmaking. So I tabled with them for many years. I think I've had I've been located all over the place in that venue. There was one year where I did the Zineland Terrace, which is just like kind of like a satellite location. But generally, I've been at TCAF every single year, and it's been a really, really great touchstone and just a very inspiring event to be a part of. One thing I really love about it is that it's at the public library, so you get these people that are really into comics, and then you just get random strangers that are like, what's happening in my library right now? And they get exposed to comics in that way. I think that's really magical and a great way of sharing comics, because I've been to other comics festivals where, they're kind of randomly located. You have to pay $15 just as a member of the public to get in. So, I just love the way that TCAF is sort of integrated into Toronto and provides all these opportunities for people to engage with comics, and not so much this year, but usually brings in a lot of international comic artists as well. So it's usually just been this injection of enthusiasm and love for comics that kind of keeps you going throughout the year.
I love our library system.
Yeah.
It's my favorite institution.
Yeah.
Love
Public
it.
library, the best. Yeah.
Do you find that zine fairs or TCAF comics festivals are more in line with what you're doing and what you're putting out?
I think so. Like I said, it has that accessibility that I really love. It has that ability to have control and self-publish your own work. Just see so much creative, amazing work in those venues. I'd love to share, like anytime I get the opportunity to share my work, if it's a gallery exhibition, whatever it is, I will pursue that, and I appreciate it. But there's just something really nice and personal in all of those experiences. Like, I've never done one of those huge Comic-Cons, but I imagine it just feeling quite overwhelming being, in such a huge venue with such huge crowds. Whereas, at TCAF, which typically is like pretty, has crowds, but it still feels like there's that space to have that individual connection with people, which I really appreciate. Yeah.
That's it for my questions. Is there anything else you wanted to add or talk about?
I don't know. I don't think so.
That's a good place to stop then.
Thank you so much, Koom.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks.
Marta Chudolinska's site is linked from the show notes. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics, and go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read it and record our critique. Critiquing Comics is back next week with Steam Gear Incorporated, a webtoon with a unique look. Adam joins me to discuss whether this unique look is a good thing or not. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.